You sit in a meeting room, surrounded by colleagues who seem to effortlessly navigate complex discussions about strategy, ethics, and long-term consequences. They speak with a clarity that feels almost alien to you, connecting dots you never even saw existed. Meanwhile, you find yourself struggling to articulate thoughts that feel muddled, trapped in patterns of thinking that served you well in your 20s, but now in your 40s or 50s feel painfully inadequate. You leave the room with a familiar heaviness in your chest, that gnawing sense that everyone else received an instruction manual for mature thinking that somehow bypassed you entirely. You wonder if you missed a crucial developmental window, if your mind stopped growing while others continued evolving into something you can barely comprehend. The frustration is not just professional, it seeps into your personal relationships, where you find yourself locked in the same circular arguments with your partner, unable to see their perspective without feeling like you are betraying your own. It affects how you parent, how you make decisions about your future, how you process the increasingly complex moral dilemmas that adulthood keeps throwing at you. You feel stuck, watching others operate from a level of consciousness that seems forever out of reach. This stagnation is not your fault, but it is devastating nonetheless. Research suggests that fewer than 30% of adults ever reach the highest stages of cognitive development, meaning the vast majority of us are navigating an increasingly complex world with thinking tools designed for simpler times. We make career decisions with adolescent logic, approach relationships with childlike expectations, and confront existential questions with frameworks that collapse under scrutiny. The cost is measurable. Broken relationships that failed because neither partner could transcend their egocentric perspective, careers plateaued because we cannot think systemically about organizational dynamics, moral paralysis in the face of ethical complexity, because we lack the cognitive architecture to hold multiple truths simultaneously. You might have blamed yourself for these failures, pathologized your struggles as personal weakness, when in reality you were simply operating with cognitive equipment that had not finished developing. Society tells us that the brain stops maturing in our mid-20s, that after that point we are working with what we have. But Jean Piaget discovered something that changes everything about how we understand human potential. The most revolutionary finding in Piaget's 7 decades of research was not that children think differently than adults, which was the headline that made him famous. It was his documentation of 6 distinct stages of mental maturity that unfold across the entire lifespan, each one representing a fundamental reorganization of how we construct reality itself, and is devastating evidence that most human beings never complete this developmental journey. Piaget spent his career in Geneva studying not just children, but adolescents and adults, meticulously documenting how thinking evolves from simple sensory reactions to the capacity for abstract reasoning that transcends personal experience, cultural conditioning, and even logical consistency when the situation demands it. What he found was both liberating and unsettling. Your cognitive development is not fixed at 25. You are not doomed to think the way you currently think. But progression through these stages requires specific conditions and conscious effort that most people never encounter or pursue. Today I am going to walk you through all 6 stages of mental maturity that Piaget identified, show you exactly where you likely stop developing and why, and give you the precise cognitive exercises that can restart your developmental trajectory. By the end of this video, you will understand why your thinking feels limited, what mature cognition actually looks like in practice, and the specific steps to reach levels of mental sophistication that currently feel impossible. In 1938, Piaget was studying a 17-year-old student in Geneva named Michel, who had come to his attention because of a peculiar problem. Michel was exceptionally bright by conventional measures, top of his class in mathematics and literature, articulate and well-read, but his teachers noticed something troubling. When presented with moral dilemmas or complex social situations, Michel would become almost paralyzed, unable to formulate positions or make decisions. In one memorable session, Piaget presented Michel with a scenario that had become standard in his research. A man's wife is dying of a rare disease. There is one drug that might save her, but the pharmacist who discovered it is charging 10 times what it costs to make, far more than the man can afford. The pharmacist refuses to lower the price or accept delayed payment. Should the man steal the drug to save his wife? Michel spent nearly 40 minutes wrestling with this question, his face contorted with genuine distress. He would start down one path of reasoning, then abruptly reverse himself, then circle back to his original position, unable to settle on any coherent response. What fascinated Piaget was not that Michel struggled with a difficult question, but the specific nature of his struggle. Michel could not hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. When he considered the husband's perspective, the rightness of stealing became absolute and obvious. When he shifted to the pharmacist's perspective, property rights became sacred and inviolable. When he thought about societal rules, order seemed paramount, but he could not integrate these viewpoints into a more comprehensive framework that acknowledged the validity and limitations of each. He was trapped in what Piaget would later call concrete operational thinking, capable of logical reasoning within a single framework, but unable to coordinate multiple frameworks or question the frameworks themselves. Piaget documented Michel's case extensively because it represented something he was seeing across hundreds of interviews with adolescents and young adults. They had mastered the cognitive tools of childhood, could think logically about concrete problems, understand cause and effect, classify and categorize information, but they hit a wall when faced with abstract complexity that required thinking about thinking itself. Michel knew that stealing was wrong according to the rules he had internalized, and he knew that letting someone die was wrong according to his moral intuitions. But he lacked the cognitive structure to recognize that rules and intuitions are human constructs that sometimes conflict, requiring meta-level reasoning to navigate. Over the following months, Piaget worked with Michel using a method that would become central to his later theories about how cognitive development can be facilitated. He did not tell Michel what to think about the dilemma or offer him a correct answer. Instead, he systematically exposed Michel to people reasoning at slightly higher levels of complexity, students and adults who could articulate how they held multiple valid perspectives in tension, who could critique the limitations of rule-based thinking without descending into relativism. Piaget asked Michel to explain these more sophisticated responses, to identify what made them different from his own reasoning, to practice using similar structures in other contexts. The progress was not linear. For weeks, Michel would appear to grasp a more integrated perspective, only to collapse back into concrete either-or thinking when faced with a new scenario. But gradually, something shifted. Michel began to use phrases like, from one perspective and depending on your framework, not as rhetorical flourishes but as genuine acknowledgments that reality could be validly constructed in multiple ways. He started to question whether the dilemma itself was fairly posed, whether the scenario contained hidden assumptions that limited possible responses. 6 months into their work together, Piaget presented Michel with a new version of the original dilemma, this one involving conflicting cultural values rather than individual moral choices. Michel's response was transformed. He outlined 4 different cultural frameworks that would lead to different conclusions, explained the internal logic and limitations of each, acknowledged that no meta-framework could definitively resolve the conflict, and then articulated his own position as a contextual choice rather than an absolute truth. He had made the leap into what Piaget called formal operational thinking, the beginning of true abstract reasoning. This case became foundational for Piaget because it demonstrated 3 principles that would define his understanding of cognitive development across the lifespan. First, development is not automatic. Michel was 17, well past the age when formal operations supposedly emerge, but he had not developed these capacities simply by getting older or accumulating experiences. Second, development requires disequilibrium. Michel had to be confronted with his own cognitive limitations, had to feel the inadequacy of his current thinking structures before he became motivated to construct more sophisticated ones. Third, development proceeds through a specific mechanism that Piaget called equilibration, where we encounter information or perspectives that do not fit our existing cognitive structures, experience disequilibrium or cognitive discomfort, and then reorganize our mental frameworks to accommodate the new complexity. The tragedy is that most people stop this process prematurely. They either avoid disequilibrium by staying in cognitively comfortable environments, or they experience it but lack the support and guidance to reorganize their thinking, rather than simply defending their existing structures more rigidly. Understanding where you stopped and why is the first step to restarting your development, but it requires honest assessment of how you currently think and the humility to recognize your cognitive limitations. The 6 stages Piaget identified represent increasingly sophisticated modes of constructing reality, each one incorporating and transcending the previous stages. Stage 1, sensor-emotor, dominates from birth to roughly age 2. Infants at this stage are pure empiricists, constructing knowledge through direct sensory experience and motor action. They learn that objects continue to exist even when out of sight, that actions have predictable effects, that they are separate entities from the world around them. This seems obvious until you watch an 8-month-old search for a toy where they last found it rather than where they saw it hidden, demonstrating that their understanding of object permanence is still tied to their own actions rather than to properties of the object itself. By the end of this stage, toddlers have constructed a basic understanding of physical causality and object permanence, but their knowledge is entirely practical, tied to action rather than representation. Stage 2, pre-operational, emerges around age 2 and extends into early childhood, roughly until age 7. This is when symbolic thinking appears, the ability to use language, engage in pretend play, form mental images of things not physically present. But thinking at this stage is still highly egocentric in a technical sense. Not that the child is selfish, but that they literally cannot differentiate their perspective from others. Show a 4-year-old a box of crayons that actually contains candles, and after discovering the trick, they will insist that another child who has not yet opened the box will also think it contains candles, unable to recognize that others can hold false beliefs different from their own knowledge. Reasoning is intuitive rather than logical, dominated by perceptual appearance rather than underlying reality. Pour water from a short, wide glass into a tall, thin glass, and the pre-operational child will insist there is now more water because the level is higher, unable to conserve quantity across perceptual transformations. Stage 3, concrete operations, emerges around age 7 and represents a massive cognitive leap. Children at this stage develop systematic logical thinking, but crucially, only about concrete, tangible things and situations. They master conservation, understanding that quantity remains constant despite changes in appearance. They can classify objects according to multiple criteria simultaneously, understand part-whole relationships, perform mental operations like addition and subtraction. But their logic is still earthbound, tied to physical reality and specific instances. Ask a 10-year-old in concrete operations to reason about hypothetical situations that violate reality, and they struggle. Pose the problem. All purple creatures have 6 legs. Zorb is a purple creature. How many legs does Zorb have? And they might respond, but purple creatures are not real, or simply refuse to engage with the premises. They can think logically about their concrete world, but cannot yet think about thinking itself, cannot reason about abstract propositions detached from physical reality. This is where Michel was trapped at 17, capable of sophisticated concrete reasoning, but unable to coordinate multiple logical systems or engage in systematic hypothesis testing about abstract concepts. Many adults remain here, functioning perfectly well in jobs that require procedural competence and concrete problem-solving, but struggling when situations demand genuine abstraction or metacognitive awareness. You see this in people who cannot understand metaphor except literally, who become confused when you discuss concepts like justice or consciousness, who need every abstract idea translated into a concrete example before they can engage with it. There is no shame in this, but recognizing it allows you to understand why certain kinds of complexity feel inaccessible. Stage 4, formal operations, typically begins to emerge in early adolescence around age 11 or 12. But Piaget's research showed that many people never fully achieve it, and those who do often do not consolidate it until their 20s or later, if at all. This is the stage where abstract reasoning becomes possible, where you can think about hypothetical situations, systematically test hypotheses, reason about logical propositions independent of their content. understand metaphor and analogy, coordinate multiple variables simultaneously. The formal operational thinker can engage with ideas like freedom or morality, not just through concrete examples, but as abstract concepts with internal logic and relationships to other concepts. They can think about thinking, recognize their own thought processes, critique their own reasoning. This is when genuine philosophy becomes possible, when you can argue about ideas for their own sake, rather than always needing to ground them in personal experience or practical application. But even this stage has limitations that Piaget documented extensively. Formal operational thinking tends to assume that logical consistency is the highest form of truth, that reality can and should conform to rational systems. The formal operational thinker often struggles with irreducible paradoxes, with situations where multiple valid logical systems produce contradictory conclusions, with the recognition that reason itself has boundaries and biases. They can think abstractly, but they still believe in capital T truth that can be accessed through proper reasoning. Michel reached this stage in his work with Piaget, but it took deliberate intervention and months of cognitive restructuring. The conversation about Jean Piaget, the stages, and mature thinking can feel heavy, almost clinical in how it dissects human cognition. But here is the reality beneath these developmental frameworks. You have probably felt the suffocating limits of your own thinking more times than you can count. Those moments when you knew, deeply knew, that your perspective was incomplete, but you could not figure out how to expand it. When you recognized that you were approaching a problem with the same mental tools that failed you last time, but you had no alternative approach. When you watched someone navigate complexity with an ease that felt like witnessing magic, and you wondered what fundamental difference separated their mind from yours. Maybe it showed up in a relationship where you could not understand why your partner experienced the situation so differently, and instead of curiosity you felt defensive, trapped in the certainty of your own perception. Or in a work crisis where everyone else seemed to see strategic options that remained invisible to you no matter how hard you concentrated. Or in confronting your own contradictory beliefs and values, unable to hold the tension, forced to declare one side right and the other wrong even though neither felt fully true. These moments are not intellectual abstractions. They are lived experiences of cognitive constraint, the feeling of banging against the walls of your own mental architecture. If you have felt this, if you recognize the specific texture of knowing you are thinking inadequately but not knowing how to think differently, leave a comment with just this simple phrase: "My mind has walls I cannot see." You do not need to explain or elaborate, just those 7 words. Your acknowledgement might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to feel less alone in their cognitive struggles, to realize that the limitation is developmental rather than personal failure. This community has more power to normalize the difficulty of mental growth than you imagine. Sharing this tiny piece of your experience creates permission for others to acknowledge their own edges, and that acknowledgement is where development begins. Stage 5, which Piaget called post-formal operations or dialectical thinking, though he was less systematic in defining it than the earlier stages, represents another fundamental reorganization of cognition that most people never achieve. If formal operations is about abstract logical reasoning within coherent systems, post-formal thinking is about recognizing that all systems are constructs, that logic itself is contextual, that truth is not discovered but created through perspective. The post-formal thinker can hold contradictory truths simultaneously without cognitive collapse, not because they are relativists who believe everything is equally valid, but because they understand that validity itself depends on the framework you are operating within. They can critique not just conclusions, but the assumptions and methods that generate conclusions, including their own. They become comfortable with irreducible complexity and paradox, recognizing that some tensions cannot and should not be resolved, but must be held in productive dialogue. This is where wisdom begins to diverge from intelligence. You can be highly intelligent, capable of complex formal reasoning, but still lack the cognitive flexibility to recognize when your reasoning framework is limiting, rather than illuminating. Piaget studied a woman named Françoise, a philosophy professor in her 40s who exemplified this stage. When presented with the same moral dilemma about stealing medicine, she did not try to resolve it through logical argumentation or appeal to principles. Instead, she deconstructed the dilemma itself, pointing out how the scenario was constructed to create false dichotomies, how it embedded individualistic Western assumptions about property and marriage, how the very act of posing it as a hypothetical removed the lived context that would actually inform any real decision. But she did this not to avoid answering, but to demonstrate that the dilemma's power came from its hidden constraints, and that recognizing those constraints opened up entirely different ways of engaging with the underlying question about competing values. She could think within multiple frameworks, critique the frameworks themselves, and then provisionally commit to action despite the lack of absolute certainty, all while maintaining awareness of the limitations of her own position. Stage 6, which Piaget hinted at but never fully elaborated, might be called trans-systemic or integral thinking, where even the distinction between frameworks and reality begins to dissolve. At this stage, which perhaps only a tiny fraction of humans ever touch, there is recognition that the self doing the thinking is itself a construct, that the separation between knower and known is a useful fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. This is where cognitive development begins to merge with contemplative wisdom traditions, where thinking becomes less about manipulating concepts and more about direct apprehension of the fluid, interdependent nature of experience itself. Piaget was ambivalent about this stage, uncertain whether it represented genuine cognitive development or a different kind of knowing altogether. But he documented cases of individuals, often people with extensive meditation practice or those who had undergone profound existential crises, who seemed to operate from a place where multiple perspectives could be held and transcended simultaneously, where decisions emerged from a kind of choiceless awareness rather than deliberative reasoning. These individuals did not think less rigorously than formal or post-formal thinkers, but they had stopped identifying with their thinking, could use conceptual frameworks as tools without being constrained by them, and demonstrated what Piaget called cognitive fluidity that allowed them to shift between levels of abstraction and modes of knowing depending on what the situation required. The devastating reality that Piaget documented across his 7 decades of research is that progression through these stages is neither automatic nor universal. Studies following his methodological approach have consistently found that while virtually everyone develops through sensorimotor and pre-operational stages, barring severe cognitive impairment, and most people in educated societies reach concrete operations, only 50 to 60% of adolescents and adults ever achieve formal operational thinking, even in the limited domains where they have expertise. Post-formal thinking appears to be reached by less than 30% of adults, often not until their 40s or 50s. And stage 6 may be so rare that it represents outlier human development rather than a reliable developmental trajectory. This means that most human beings stop developing cognitively somewhere in late childhood or adolescence, then spend the rest of their lives accumulating information and experience but not fundamentally reorganizing how they construct meaning. They become more knowledgeable but not more cognitively sophisticated, more practiced at using their existing mental tools but not more capable of developing new ones. You see this in older adults who have decades of life experience but still think about relationships with adolescent logic, who have succeeded in complex careers but reason about politics or ethics with striking simplicity, who have suffered and survived profound challenges but have not developed correspondingly sophisticated frameworks for meaning-making. Age does not equal development. Experience does not guarantee growth, and the default trajectory is stagnation rather than progression. Why do people stop developing? Piaget identified 3 primary factors, each one representing a missing condition necessary for stage transition. Factor 1 is lack of disequilibrium. Cognitive development requires encountering situations that your current thinking cannot adequately handle, experiences that create productive confusion and dissatisfaction with your existing frameworks. But modern life, especially for adults, is largely organized around avoiding disequilibrium. We curate social networks of people who think like us, consume media that confirms our existing worldview, choose careers that reward our established competencies, and avoid situations that would expose our cognitive limitations. The result is an equilibrium trap, where we feel comfortable but stagnant, never encountering the productive crisis that would motivate development. People in concrete operations stay there because their concrete world is manageable with concrete thinking, People in early formal operations stay there because their professional and social lives can be navigated with abstract but logically consistent reasoning. The complexity that would demand post-formal thinking, genuine irreducible paradox and systemic contradiction, can usually be avoided or simplified. Factor 2 is lack of guided reorganization. When you do encounter disequilibrium, when your thinking proves inadequate, the default response is defensive rather than developmental. You experience the discomfort not as an invitation to grow, but as a threat to defend against, leading to rationalization, denial, or rigid insistence that your existing framework is correct and the world is wrong. Without someone or something to guide the reorganization process, to model more sophisticated thinking, and help you construct new cognitive structures rather than just defending old ones, disequilibrium leads to entrenchment rather than development. Piaget's work with Michel succeeded because he provided this guidance, but most adults have no access to cognitive mentors who operate at higher stages and can facilitate their development. Factor 3 is lack of motivation. Cognitive development is hard, requires sustained effort and tolerance for prolonged discomfort, and offers no guarantee of immediate practical payoff. Why would you undertake the difficult work of reorganizing your thinking when your current thinking allows you to function adequately in your life? The motivation has to come from somewhere beyond practical necessity, from a sense that your current way of being in the world is somehow insufficient even when it is working, from curiosity about your own potential, or dissatisfaction with feeling cognitively constrained. Many people simply never develop this motivation. They are content with their current level of understanding, or they are so busy managing the demands of life that they have no energy left for developmental work, or they have internalized the cultural message that the way you think in your 20s is the way you will think for the rest of your life, so why bother trying to change it? The combination of these three factors creates a developmental landscape where progression is rare and stagnation is normative. You did not fail to develop because you are lazy or stupid or damaged. You failed to develop because the conditions necessary for development were not present, and recognizing this is the first step toward creating those conditions intentionally. Piaget's most important contribution, the insight that transformed cognitive science and remains revolutionary today, was his mechanism of equilibration. This is how stage transitions actually happen, the process by which encountering cognitive inadequacy leads to structural reorganization rather than defensive rigidity. Equilibration operates through three phases that Piaget documented across thousands of observations. Phase 1 is assimilation, where you encounter new information or experience and try to understand it using your existing cognitive structures. A concrete operational child encounters the concept of infinity and tries to assimilate it by imagining a really big number, using their existing framework of quantity. A formal operational adult encounters irreducible paradox and tries to assimilate it by finding the logical error, using their existing framework that contradictions indicate faulty reasoning. This initial assimilation attempt often works for a while, allows you to maintain your current equilibrium, but eventually you encounter situations where forcing the new information into your old framework produces such distortion that you cannot ignore the inadequacy. Phase 2 is disequilibrium, the uncomfortable recognition that your current thinking is insufficient. This is not just intellectual confusion but visceral cognitive discomfort, the feeling that your mental ground is unstable, that categories you relied on are arbitrary, that reasoning you trusted leads to absurd conclusions. The concrete operational child realizes that no matter how big a number they imagine, there is always one bigger, that infinity is not a quantity at all, but a different kind of concept that breaks their existing framework. The formal operational adult realizes that the paradox is not a sign of logical error, but a genuine feature of reality, that their assumption that logic should always produce consistent answers is itself questionable. Most people flee this discomfort immediately, retreat back to their existing structures and either ignore the problematic information or rationalize it away. But if you can tolerate the disequilibrium, if you can sit with the discomfort of not knowing and not prematurely resolve it by retreating to familiar ground, Phase 3 becomes possible. Phase 3 is accommodation, where you actually restructure your cognitive frameworks to adequately integrate the new complexity. This is not just adding new information to existing categories, but reorganizing the categories themselves, developing new mental operations that transcend the limitations of the previous stage. The concrete operational child makes the leap into formal operations by constructing abstract conceptual thinking that can handle ideas detached from physical instantiation. The formal operational adult makes the leap into post-formal thinking by constructing meta-awareness that can critique logical systems themselves and hold multiple valid frameworks in tension. Accommodation is rare because it requires both tolerating disequilibrium long enough for reorganization to occur and having exposure to models of more sophisticated thinking that show what the reorganization might look like. But when it happens, it is unmistakable. There is a sudden clarity where confusion existed, a feeling of expanded capacity, a recognition that you can now think thoughts that were literally impossible for you before. Piaget described it as like getting new mental organs, not just new skills but new ways of processing reality itself. The tragedy is that our educational system and culture provide almost no support for this process beyond late adolescence. Children get some scaffolding for moving through early stages, though even that is inadequate. But adults are assumed to be cognitively finished and are given no guidance or encouragement for continued development. The result is mass developmental arrest, entire populations stuck in cognitive stages designed for simpler forms of life than the complexity we actually face. Understanding your own stage requires brutal honesty and systematic assessment. Most people significantly overestimate their cognitive sophistication because from inside a stage you cannot see its limitations. Only from beyond can you recognize what you were unable to think before. But there are telltale signs if you know what to look for. Are you capable of genuine abstract reasoning detached from concrete examples, or do you always need ideas grounded in specific instances to understand them? When you encounter logical paradox or situations where valid reasoning leads to contradictory conclusions, do you experience it as error to be resolved or as fundamental feature of complexity to be held? Can you critique not just specific beliefs but the frameworks and assumptions that generate beliefs, including your own? Can you hold multiple contradictory perspectives as simultaneously valid without collapsing into relativism or having to declare one right? Do you experience your thinking as tool you can examine and modify, or as transparent reality you look through but never at? Can you shift between levels of abstraction fluidly depending on what the situation requires, or are you stuck operating at one level? These questions point toward different stages, and answering them honestly, ideally with input from people who know you well and can observe how you actually reason under pressure rather than how you think you reason, begins to reveal where you currently operate. The goal is not judgment but accurate assessment, because you cannot restart development without knowing where you stopped. Restarting your development is possible at any age, but it requires creating the three conditions Piaget identified as essential. First, seek disequilibrium deliberately. Place yourself in situations where your current thinking proves inadequate, where you encounter perspectives and complexities that do not fit your existing frameworks. Read philosophy that confuses you, engage with people who think fundamentally differently, take on challenges that expose your cognitive limitations. The discomfort is not a sign you are failing, but evidence you are encountering the edges where growth becomes possible. Second, find cognitive mentors who operate at stages beyond your current level. These might be therapists trained in developmental models, philosophers, meditation teachers, or simply individuals in your life whose thinking demonstrates sophistication you aspire to. Watch how they reason, ask them to explain their thought processes, practice using similar structures even when they feel unnatural. Third, cultivate motivation by connecting development to meaning rather than utility. You are not upgrading your thinking to be more productive or successful, though that might happen. You are developing because living with expanded consciousness, with the capacity to hold more complexity and see from more perspectives, is intrinsically valuable. It makes you more fully human. The truth beneath all of Piaget's research is that your mind is not fixed. The walls you feel are real but not permanent. Every stage you have already moved through required reorganizing everything you thought you knew about thinking itself, and you did it without even realizing the magnitude of what was happening. You can do it again, but this time consciously, deliberately, with full awareness that you are constructing new ways of being in the world. Michel at 17 felt trapped in his concrete logic until someone showed him what lay beyond. Françoise, in her 40s, discovered post-formal thinking through philosophical crisis. You right now, wherever you have stopped, can restart the developmental journey that most people abandon. It will not be easy or quick, but it is possible. If this resonates with you, if you recognize yourself somewhere in these stages and feel the pull toward continued growth, consider staying connected to this exploration. Every week I share insights about cognitive development, consciousness, and the practical work of expanding how you think and perceive. This is not about collecting information, but about genuine transformation, the kind that changes how you experience reality itself. You are not alone in wanting more from your mind than what you currently have. There is a community here of people doing this developmental work together, and your presence adds to that collective growth. The button below is not just a subscription, but a commitment to your own continued evolution. Next, we will explore Piaget's most controversial discovery about why smart people often think poorly and the specific cognitive traps that keep even formally operational thinkers stuck in adolescent reasoning patterns for decades.